Welcome to the Fret Dojo podcast, the place where pro guitar players share their secrets. Visit www.FretDojo.com to access online courses and free resources to take your guitar playing to the next level.
Welcome everyone to the Fret Dojo podcast. My name is Ryan, community manager, and I'm joined by Vin, Fret Dojo instructor, and we've got a great show for you today. We're joined by Davy Mooney, who is a wonderful jazz guitar player and educator, and I'll take a moment now to tell you a bit about him. Davy Mooney is a jazz guitarist from New Orleans. He's an associate professor of jazz studies and head of the jazz guitar program at the University of North Texas, where he teaches private lessons and advanced jazz improvisation. Mooney received his master's degree from the University of New Orleans in 2005. Shortly thereafter, he relocated to New York City and began performing at clubs such as the 55 Bar, the Bar Next Door, the Blue Note, and Smalls. He competed in the 2005 Thelonious Monk International Jazz Guitar Competition, where he placed third. He then studied at the Thelonious Monk Institute of Jazz Performance from 2007 to 2009, where he worked with many jazz legends, including Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter, and Ron Carter. Mooney has a PhD in jazz performance from New York University, and he wrote a dissertation on the early 1960s work of jazz guitar legend Joe Pass. He's recorded 7 CDs as a band leader and many others as a sideman. His latest is Way Back, released in June 2023. Mooney has toured the United States extensively, as well as Brazil, Japan, Mexico, and many other countries. He also has 2 instructional books published by Mel Bay, Personalizing Jazz Vocabulary and Into the Labyrinth, An Anatomy of Position Playing for Jazz Guitar. We are very pleased to welcome Davy Mooney to the Fret Dojo podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Davy, welcome. Welcome. Very excited to talk to you today.
Yes, I'll just jump right in. We usually like to start with kind of a biographical question. How did you kind of start out with jazz guitar? What was your introduction to it, and what was kind of the impetus for you studying?
Yeah, sure. So, growing up in New Orleans, I was fortunate to have a performing arts high school, the New Orleans Center for Creative Arts, that I was able to attend when I was like 14, 15 years old. But I got into jazz. I was playing guitar, and I sort of started out in the 80s, with like hair metal bands, got into some like thrash metal, like Megadeth, and then sort of prog rock. And I feel like the prog rock path sometimes leads you towards jazz a little bit. And I have an uncle who plays, semi-professional jazz piano, and he was always talking about Sonny Rollins, Wes Montgomery. And there was just also a really great jazz guitar teacher in New Orleans named Hank Mackey, who was taught, just about everybody in New Orleans, like Steve Mazikowski, Teddy Ludwig, the late, great Todd Duke. And I was able to had lessons with Hank, and eventually got into the New Orleans Center for Creative Arts, where, it's where the Marsalis family went, and Terrence Blanchard, and I guess the younger generation like Jonathan Batiste and Sullivan Fortner. So I was really fortunate in that when I was in high school, I would spend half the day, I would go to my regular school, and then after lunch, I would go to Noka and play jazz guitar all day for the rest of the day. And I had Hank to show me how things worked. So it was very, very fortunate. So by the time I got to college, I was pretty advanced at like straight ahead playing.
Yeah, that's awesome. I like how you kind of noted that prog rock to jazz. I almost kind of did the opposite thing. I was listening to a bunch of jazz, and then I kind of discovered Alan Holdsworth and all those kind of guys. But it is interesting, that thread that connects them. I was curious about New Orleans. Obviously you mentioned a lot of great institutions that are there. Do you feel like there was anything about just kind of the scene of that city that contributed to, something unique about your growth?
Oh, yeah, definitely. One thing that I don't know if it's totally unique to New Orleans, but there's always just like a ton of gigs and a ton of work. And musicians are kind of like mini celebrities, You don't have to be famous internationally, whatever. If you're playing gigs in New Orleans, I got the sense it was kind of glamorous, and also kind of blue collar, and that you could make a decent living. New Orleans is more expensive now, but when I was even like my early 20s, it was really cheap to live there, and I could just do these gigs, Sunday brunch and social gigs, but also just gigs for tips and make a living. Plus, I think growing up seeing like the professors at University of New Orleans and Loyola I kind of could see like a future path to where you would play, but also teach and have like a little bit of a sort of middle class lifestyle, and people would have families, and so it just seemed very possible to have a life in jazz and in music, whether or not you became like the most famous, whatever world famous musician. It was just kind of a part of the culture and the city that you would play jazz and it would be appreciated, and they would pay you.
Yeah, it's always good. Like you said, having that model. Could you maybe talk about a little bit
Uh-huh.
about sort of that part of your path, going from kind of being freelance into, educating at the university level?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I come from, my parents were both college professors. My dad taught at University of New Orleans, and my mom did for a while too. So the academia thing is not that strange to me. It's actually like very normal. Um, but it was a long road. When you look back, man, there was a lot. Like I said, I was doing freelance. I came here to UNT for my undergrad from New Orleans, and then I moved back. It's funny. I tell my students the way it worked. It was interesting. Like in each little interval of my life, I would do a school thing, and then I'd have 2 years out there in the trenches hustling, and then I would go back to school, and there were 2 years, and it actually, like, my undergrad 2 years, then I did my master's. Then Hurricane Katrina happened. That's a little more complicated, but there were 2 years, and I did the Monk Institute. There were 2 years I did my PhD, and then there was 2 to 4 years, and then I got this job, and now I'm all out of uh, school to go to. Now I'm the teacher at school, but I mean, that's kind of a simplified uh, chronology of it. But yeah, I got out of school. It was important to me to try to have something going on outside of the academic environment. I did a lot of time in New York. I lived in New York for like 6 years, on and off, just booking gigs and doing what everybody does, trying to hustle. And luckily, I was able to get in touch with Sunnyside Records, and I do things with them and play some clubs in New York, which kind of helps, your cachet when you try to go to other places and you say, I played at this place, and people are like, oh wow, And but I've always kind of pursued both of things in tandem, whether it's teaching. It wasn't always university teaching. I taught a lot in the back of the music store and that kind of thing, teaching like strumming chords for kids for many years. But I think, like I said, growing up and seeing that, it seemed realistic to me. I mean, it wasn't easy, but it seemed like the path that I think I was always kind of pursuing, whether I knew it or not, to end up here. So.
Yeah, it's cool you mentioned living in New York. Being living in New Orleans and living in New York, those are kind of two jazz centers. How would you compare those?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I mean, I think that they're kind of opposites in some way, but they're like, for me, they're two sides of my personality. And I always felt like artistically, I was like a little too modern for New Orleans and not modern enough for New York. Because I had this weird combination. Like, I did a lot of like traditional jazz gigs in New Orleans. And I actually valued that a lot, in that you have to, artistically, you have to kind of get to the point and play melodically and be kind of declarative in the things that you play. And your hot licks don't really go that far. But then if you play too many, I feel like I have this little melodic thing that sometimes is a little too cutesy for New York. People are like, what's that garbage? Show me what's the newest scale, like what's the newest chord, what's the newest time signature that hasn't even been invented yet. But I like both of those things. Like I like a little bit of both, and I mix it together. So it's definitely like parts of my personality. I mean, one other thing, New Orleans and New York, is I always felt that in New Orleans, music is just part of the everything you do, society. Like, you go to eat somewhere and there's music, and you go down the street and there's somebody playing. And whereas, and it's not to say that there aren't clubs that you go to sit down and hear music, but I felt like in New York, it was very much like getting a gig kind of meant that you were responsible for the people being there. And that was, oddly enough, that was kind of strange to me, because the way I grew up, there was always people there, and they were just like, okay, we need somebody to do this gig, to play the music for these people that are here, rather than like, okay, you make the music and you get the people to come. And I was like, wait a second, is that how it works? But luckily, there's some clubs in New York where it's not, like small. Some places are tourists, combination of tourists and musicians, where you're there for the vibe, which I actually prefer. Not only because then I don't have to be as responsible for getting people out, but I just kind of like that community atmosphere where the music is part of something that's already happening, maybe, or it's an integral part. And that was a New Orleans thing growing up. That's always the way it was to me. It was always just around, and so you would be a part of it. But if you got too weird, you got too strange, people want to dance, they want to have a good time. So that would get kind of annoying. Like, I got these tunes I'm writing and I want to play like Kurt Rosenwinkel a little bit. And in New Orleans, people didn't necessarily want to hear that. And so, yeah, they're very different sides of my personality, for sure. The two cities. Yeah. Of course, and again, this might be out of date too, like I'm talking like 25 years ago at this point. So who knows?
Yeah, definitely. It definitely does seem like the traditional New Orleans thing is kind of its own. It almost becomes its own shed or its own kind of branch of where the music's at. Now it kind of seems like bebop and hard bop is kind of the mainstream in terms of what people are doing, and even post bop and beyond that.
Oh yeah, totally. That was and I played. When I got back from UNT, another thing that I found was really interesting is in New Orleans, there weren't at the time, if you go to New York and you want to play like in a tango band, you're not going to be able to do that because there's people from like Buenos Aires there, and that's what they do. Or if you want to play Brazilian music or choro music, you're not going to do it because there's people that know what they're doing. But in New Orleans, it was like everybody just fakes it. So I played in all these different bands and different opportunities. And so we had like a band called the Hot Club of New Orleans, doing like a Django thing, but I don't have any Django training or chops at all. So I was just playing I was like, oh, 4 Django, Joe Pass. I love that record. Let's play 4/4, and I'll play my normal like boppy type solos. And because there was, no one really schooled in the manouche style at the time, I don't think there was, that you had these opportunities to do all these different types of music and kind of fake it. And New York, I didn't feel like that. I feel like in New York, I had to be a specialist at something, or I had to be like, it had to be the Davy Mooney experience. It couldn't be like Davy Mooney trying a little of this and a little bit of that, because people would be like, what are you doing? Like, why are you on this gig? So that was another thing that I found odd for me.
Do you find it's, is that kind of something that came out of listening a ton, or just being able to make those kind of small stylistic adjustments, or...
Yeah, just faking it. I think imitation, being a good jazz musician, you definitely have to be a good imitator. And I would just kind of like, I think I have a knack for, to a point, like you can fake it until, especially if people don't hear the real thing, they can't tell. But if then they hear, they're like, hey, wait a second, that's not right what you're doing. But a lot of it's just fascination, and there were these gigs. And I have to hand it to UNT. Part of it is I could read music, because going to school here, guitar players were not exactly like famous for our reading ability. But that was a big focus with Fred Hamilton, my professor, my teacher here, who I took over for. Like, you had to read. So then I got out of school and everybody was like, oh my God, you're such a great reader. And I was like, no, it's just everyone else can't read. They're going like, every good boy. They can't read anything. So I could do these gigs. They put music in front of me. I'd be like, oh, okay.
Yeah, this is the guy. Yeah, that's great.
Join this band. We have music. No one else could read it except you. So that was part of it. And just fascination. Like, I love a lot of different styles of music. I like mixing things together. There's a lot of cool music out there. And so I would always like seek out those opportunities. When I was younger, now, I don't have much time to go out there and do it. But when I was in my 20s, that was fascinating.
Yeah, it's awesome. We would read sometimes those Fred Hamilton arrangements in our guitar ensemble class. Man, some of those things are gnarly.
Yeah. But, the solis are brutal. They still are. They're killing people like this semester. Yeah. I'm like, oh, here comes the solis. Everybody's going to eat it on this soli. Yeah, he would go crazy on the solis.
Kind of turning thing. Well, I guess still kind of in the vein of talking about community and the scene and stuff like that. You were at the Rocky Mountain Art Shop Fest this fall, I guess you'd say. Can you talk a bit about that? What that experience was like?
Oh yeah, that was great. This was my second time going, and Peter Henriksen puts it together, and I love his amps. I love like the little
Yeah.
tiny Bud 6. Man, I love
Yeah.
that amp. It's so good. It's like something. There's been some great advance in like solid state technology because that amp is
No,
like super
totally.
warm. It doesn't. Anyway, I love that amp. So he puts it together, and it's starting to grow. It's just kind of fun because that's another maybe dichotomy in the jazz guitar world. Because I grew up very much like studying with Hank Mackey. I guess you would call it. I mean, what's the term? Sort of straight ahead. Wes Montgomery, Joe Pass, Howard Alden, who was there, people like that, Jimmy Bruno, and I think in the '90s that was like very strong in the pre Rosenwinkel era of jazz guitar, and that's like what I came up doing for sure. Like, my dissertation is on the early '60s Joe Pass, and that's still like my favorite music in the world. Like when I listen to jazz guitar, I often I'll put that on, or I'll put on Boss guitar or something like that. So I feel like that is kind of the basis of that particular community. And my old friend Teddy Ludwig is there, who I know from New Orleans. And it's interesting for me because I still have one foot in that world, but I'm also my music is very kind of eclectic, and I sort of have a foot. Again, it gets back to this too modern for New Orleans and not modern enough for New York. I have like a foot in both worlds. So I really enjoy, playing real like straight ahead standard tunes and being in that community. And, I play 7 string. So there's the connection of like the Pizzarellis and Howard and folks like that. Steve Herberman was there, a really fabulous 7 string player. But it was just a great like little hang in the hotel, just I did a duo thing with Corey Christiansen. I did a solo guitar concert. I got up there solo. That was crazy. I don't know why I do that to myself, but I feel like an obligation to do it. And then I'm like, oh
Yeah.
my God, it's so
Yeah.
hard, solo guitar, especially like
Oh,
Paul
yeah,
Goss
man.
was there and all these people. And I'm like, what am I doing? But I was like, all right, let's do this. But yeah, it was just a really cool vibe and atmosphere, and it seems to be growing. Plus, all the guitar makers with these amazing instruments. You see just the artistry of these people that build these incredible instruments, and they're hanging out too. So it was funny. I was joking with Corey about how when I play gigs normally, I'm not a big like pedal board person, but I have a couple. Like I have a volume pedal, I have a little distortion that I use just as kind of like a gain boost. I have a reverb pedal, and I was like, I would never. No one pulled out any pedals, right? Because we're playing these
Yeah.
beautiful archtop guitars, and it's all about like the sound of the instrument. But it was just funny because when I go to a gig, see someone play in New York, or I mean, your average jazz guitar player these days has like a ton of like stuff. I mean, not everyone, Peter Bernstein doesn't, but many, and I do. So we were joking about that. I'm like, oh, he's like, I think I pulled my pedals out for one gig. And you're like scared to
Yeah.
show them,
Yeah,
the
right.
Benedetto.
Yeah.
But it was great. It was a great time. I'm going to go, if they'll have me, I'm going to go every year. It's really, really fun.
Yeah, I always feel behind in that regard. I see a lot of my peers and colleagues using all these boards, and even seeing guys like Sean Purcell getting some really cool sounds and straight ahead concepts, that kind of stuff. But that's always been, I don't know. I think I'm scared of all the wiring.
I'm bad at it. Yeah, I don't know. I just never went that route, and like I said, I remember one time I was back in New Orleans and Hank Mackey saw me play. He was like, "Boy, I didn't teach you to play with that stuff." We're just kind of joking, but also kind of like, "What are you doing, dude?" But honestly, I use it. I use very minimal. I do like the volume pedal, like
Yeah, that's
be
great.
able to do swells and things like that. And I like I said, I have this Boss Overdrive, Super Overdrive.
Yeah,
the
that
little
one's
yellow one,
fantastic.
which is like the cheapest one. I love that pedal. It used to be like only $35. I mean, they break every like couple years, and now it's like I don't know what it is now, but I just use it as like more of a gain boost. And my students are like, they have gain boost pedals, and I was like, yeah, but this one works for me, and I know what to do with it. So it's actually very little distortion. But drummers tend to. I mean, I shouldn't always blame drummers, but they tend to play kind of loud, and sometimes for the solo, I need that extra little boost to get above for the solos. But the last record, I don't use it in the studio that much. I feel like in the studio you don't really need it, and it kind of compresses the sound before you really want it compressed for my sound. So like when we did Way Back, I didn't use it at all. But if I do gigs, I'll have it there just for like a little bump in the game.
That's interesting. Yeah, I might have to try that out because I have my I same pedal, which is great. I think it's like $60 now.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, man,
yeah.
inflation.
But comparatively,
Killer.
I mean, as far as distortion pedals go, that's pretty good. But you have to try that out. Right now, I use that on all my rock gigs where I'm faking it on those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. No, I just put it like I put the tone at about 3 o'clock. I put the drive at 3 o'clock, and I put the level at like 1. Wait, what am I talking about? 3 o'clock, 9 o'clock. I'm sorry. That way. 9. That's 9 o'clock. Yeah, 9 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and then 1 o'clock. While we're back,
Yeah, the clock.
you know what I mean, like 1 o'clock. So the distortion is really, it would be 3, but the clock, it's just a little bit, very little distortion, and I keep the tone down pretty low, so it's kind of warm-ish. But yeah, just boost the sound, boost the signal a bit.
Yeah, you mentioned the 7-string. What was kind of your? I mean, that kind of seems like a big leap to take into getting a whole different instrument. Can you maybe talk about that and what kind of musical outcomes you derive from that extended range?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, basically, growing up in New Orleans, we had Steve Mazikowski, who's probably my main mentor for the way I play the guitar. And he had a 7-string guitar, but his was like a spaceship because it had 5 extra frets. He designed it, and it had 5 extra frets that went lower. So he had like a low E, and he had the bass range, and you would watch him play it, and you just didn't know where anything was, and it was very intimidating. But Hank Mackey switched to 7-string around like 1999 or 2000. And the late, great Jimmy Foster was a wonderful luthier who lived north of New Orleans. He was building them. He built one of Steve's, and then he built one for Hank. And Teddy Ludwig kind of got us all into it, too. He was when Hank switched and Hank was writing these nice arrangements for 7-string, we could all just sort of see the possibilities. And again, for me, too, it was a lot of just like functionality of gigging in New Orleans. They didn't have to hire a bass player, which was a pain, but they would get you and you'd be like, oh, God.
Yeah, and you get paid double, right?
Rock bass and play chords. Yeah, all night. And then it was funny, just a slight digression, because I remember I went to New York. I remember like walking bass in New York and realizing that like on a guitar on a 7-string, that's like the most corny thing you could ever do. Like if you do that, but in New Orleans, like they want you to do, like if you didn't do it, they'd be like, what are you doing? Like we didn't hire a bass player. We hired you with the low string, walk the bass. It was so funny, like a sort of cultural kind of like, huh? But I tell my students that I was like, it's okay if you can walk the bass here, but don't go, man, you go up like north of the Mason-Dixie line, don't be walking bass on the East Coast. They don't like that. But yeah, so I just started, messing around with it. I got a Foster, I had some money. I don't know where I got the money from. But he built me one. And I remember it came just in time for my senior recital here at UNC when I was an undergrad. And I worked out this arrangement on But Beautiful with some chords and harp harmonics and things. And, I was just trying to, Mazikowski did a lot of harp harmonics and Lenny Breau. That 7-string school. Also Phil DeGree, a great guitar player in New Orleans, who had another, like, I think he had a 17-string guitar because it's a 7-string with a harp on the side, and it's a high A instead of a low A. And, like I use it now for solo gigs and duos. I mean, I don't use it when there's a bass player so much, but it does it adds a lot, for the solo thing. And I do a lot of solo gigs around here. I enjoy, I mean, sometimes I enjoy it. Sometimes I'm like, it's just so hard, solo. You do like a 3-hour solo gig.
Yeah, it's brutal.
It's tough. It's still, I keep waiting for it to get easier, and it doesn't really get easier. It's just but it's kind of my thing. Like I was doing one the other day, and the guy who booked the gig he's like, how come you don't have a looper pedal? Because he'll hire other people to do solo, and they'll like have the looper thing. And I'm like, and I'm not against it, but mainly it's because I don't have a looper pedal, and I'm sure it's not that hard, but I'd have to figure out how it works. And also at this point, I told him, like, I'm the guy that doesn't have the looper pedal. Like that's kind of my thing. Like, I'm the one that's up here like dying
right
on a 3-hour solo gig with a 7-string with no looper pedal. That's me. That's what they come to see. So anyway, but I enjoy it. The 7. It really, for anything where there's no bass, any duo or solo situation. It really
that's
helps.
Cool. Yeah, those solo gigs, it's kind of like the full body workout of of guitar, where it's like your repertoire's got to be there because you got to play so many more tunes, and if you're doing like a trio hit or something, and then the arrangements got to be good, your voice, all that stuff. Yeah, that's a really great test of like,
Yeah.
how well you have stuff together. Is go
Yeah.
book a solo gig.
Yeah, I have a different repertoire. It's definitely a smaller one, stuff where I can pull off. When it's and then there's like solo
Mm-hmm.
where no one's listening, which is one thing. That's a certain type of gig. But solo when you're like on the stage and you're the attraction is
Yeah.
something totally different. Where you have to be like, people might actually like, watch what you're doing. Like, hey, what happened there? So I've got it. I've got a good. I can get through 3 hours. I don't know what would happen if it were 4 hours. Maybe I could do 4. Hopefully,
Yeah.
I never have to do that. But Rocky Mountain Archtop. It was like an hour set, which for me was. I mean, it wasn't easy, but in terms of like, I could just pick my best ones for an hour.
And so you play a Benedetto guitar. How did that connection come about? Did they reach out to you, or were you kind of a fan? Yeah, plug it.
Well, actually, it's funny. I tell people that back when I was scuffling and I needed like a free guitar or an endorsement, like nobody wanted to give me one. And then when I got this job, I think because partially, I have so many students, and UNT is such a big program. Howard Paul contacted me, and he came out and did the CEO of Benedetto, and he came out and did a workshop here for us, which was really nice on like archtop guitar and things like that. And he offered. He was like, come out to Savannah. And I don't have like the Davy Mooney model or whatever, but he had a few guitars there. That's interesting. I chose this one. It's the Bravo Deluxe. You can see it. And he had another one that was maybe more like a carved top. Like this is a laminated top, maybe like more expensive and kind of fancier. But I knew that I was going to be using it plugged in, with a rhythm section. And it seemed like the point of having one of those really amazing acoustic instruments. I chose this one on purpose, and also because I really love the sound of that. Like the 175 kind of like Joe Pass on Ford Django, like a laminated top, arch top plugged in. I think it's just like a really, really great sound, and it's a sound I have in my head. It's sort of the sound I grew up with listening to. So it was perfect, and I'm glad that it worked out because the instruments are so great. They're so even. There's a thing, the level of workmanship, like there's from the lowest note to the highest note. Nothing like jumps out and nothing stays, doesn't jump out, whatever the opposite of it. It's just a really great instrument. So I love it.
Well, how about if we take a moment? I'm still here. By the way, I know I've been real quiet. I just been soaking all this in, but I'm really curious now. I want to hear something. So your latest release was released back in the summer, way back, and you gave us a tune, Wintry Mix. We're going to be listening to. Anything you can tell us about this one before we listen?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of my more sort of eclectic. I almost found it to be kind of cinematic, and I did a collaboration with an animation professor at UT Dallas, University of Texas at Dallas, Dr. Christine Veras, and she did like a manual, non-computer animation, like old school animation video that's on my YouTube channel. And yeah, it's got a little bit of everything. I mean, we recorded the CD in Brazil with some musicians I play with in Sao Paulo, as well as John Ellis, great tenor player from North Carolina, but who's lived in New York forever. And it's got a little bit. It's got some country. I got the train beat. I had the drummer do the train beat, and there's the guitar solo is in there, the sax solo, the jazz improv parts. But it's an example of me just like mixing a lot of different styles together, and I think I got away with it on this one. I was encouraged. Terrence Blanchard was sort of the enabler, like at the Monk Institute. I would have these crazy ideas of mixing things together, and he would be like, "Yeah, do it," And so this is one of those crazy ideas.
Well, excellent. Okay, so then let's take a listen. This is Davy Mooney, Wintry Mix. Okay, that was Wintry Mix from Davy Mooney. Fantastic. I want to ask you a little something about one of your instructional books, Into the Labyrinth. I was reading the description. I'm going to read the description. Um, it says, if you've ever wondered about the depth of thought versus pattern playing that goes into jazz guitar improvisation, you'll find the answer in this book. Davy Mooney is as fluent in writing about the physical and cerebral processes of jazz guitar improvisation. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean that's the Mill Bay people came up with that, and I thought it was pretty cool. I was like, oh, okay, cool, that's what I'm doing. But I mean, this book, the reason I did it, like the first book is about incorporating jazz vocabulary into your guitar playing, because I found that a lot of not just guitar players but improvisers, my generation and maybe a little younger, they were good with chord scales and getting in the right key areas, but what was missing was those little nuggets of jazz vocabulary that make something sound like, for lack of a better term, jazz versus some other thing. And so I was real hardcore on that for a while, and I still use that book. But I started to realize that that I may have been just making an assumption that everybody knew the chord scale part and the scale stuff. And I found with some students, they were actually like, they had some definite holes in their sort of fretboard knowledge. And it took me a while to actually write the book. One, because, when I was coming up, we didn't have the internet. And when someone showed you some information, like, okay, this is how you play the scales. And I remember specifically, I talk about it in the book, at Loyola Jazz Camp in the summer of 1992 or 93, John Eubanks gave me a piece of paper, and it was like, these are the scale shapes, go learn them. And I was like, huh. And I went home and I actually learned them, which was the weird part. But I didn't figure out until much later that was the cage system, the cage shapes. And I think I actually didn't learn all of them, because one of them I already knew, but with a different fingering. And so I had this kind of like, as I was thinking of what I did, I was seeing students, basically not knowing their scales, not knowing the fretboard. And, you can go on the internet and it's like, oh, do it this way, do it that way. The cage system is crap. You got to do 3 notes, 4 notes on a string, and Segovia and this and that. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to write a book that talks about how I did it, like how I arrived at, just in terms of the neck, how I learned how to play over tunes and all of that, know where everything was. And I realized it was very much like sort of a piecemeal process, right? Like a little bit of that cage system, and then arpeggio shapes and arpeggio fragments even. And so what I tried to do in the narrative, I was like, how am I going to organize this, So I have those introductory chapters of just telling my story, basically. And, when I really get into it, like the meat of the book, I have, some jazz progressions that are pretty common ones and some very difficult ones. And just I went through different chunks of the neck. Like if I had to be stuck in like between frets 3 and 6 and play countdown, like where do I know where everything is? What would I do? And actually go through with chord diagrams and like, this is what I'm improvising off of. So I would record myself doing it and watch back, and I'm like, oh yeah. And try to think, it's hard when you're improvising to also think like, what am I doing? But then again, I realize I do the same thing over and over again. Like I use the same shapes and the same little fragments of arpeggios and things. I just manipulate them in different ways every time. And those are the things that I'm improvising with. So I try to write like all of them and, just as they were occurring to me. And I transcribe the improvisation. And I also have like all 8th note etudes, because that was another thing I did a lot to develop 8th note lines. I used to do that all the time. But I try to be like really, really thorough. And I think if anything, the book is very, very thorough. It's very dense. But I wanted to just be really honest about the process and like the material I'm actually using to improvise. And it's more specific than a scale or an arpeggio. It's like this little grip that I use when I'm right here and it's this chord. And I do it every time, but I might like, I improvise around it, but this is the thing. And so, I'm sure it's different for everybody, although some of us, there's only so many shapes. There's probably some similar things. But so I got pretty deep into it, and there's a lot of stuff in the book.
Right. Okay.
So I was curious about has teaching at the university level. You kind of talked about being on the other side of the of the blackboard, I guess. But now being up being up in the teaching position, is there kind of anything you think about differently as you're seeing students as opposed to being a student?
Oh yeah. I mean, one thing that I find kind of, maybe this is ironic, is that I actually play more modern jazz guitar now that I'm teaching here than I ever did when I was out playing professionally. Because, I just do it all day long. And I think I've gotten a lot better at it, honestly, like just playing the tunes, like the really hard tunes, because you have to teach them, and students come in. I remember just like my first semester, they come in with these songs that, I did when I was a student, 26-2, and I'm like, how does this go again? And I have to teach it, to them. So after a few years, you realize like you really have to be, you can't really BS them, because especially, grad students, but even the students here are really good. So I think they would sniff that out pretty quickly. And I teach like graduate improvisation. So it's all people coming to study grad school. Some of them are just like amazing players. And so I just had to be really on top of my game in a way that, it sounds funny, but in the professional world, I guess I was pursuing like my own music. So I was like writing a lot of music, playing a lot of originals. I would do some standards, but it wasn't always like a gig where we play Giant Steps and then we play, Wayne Shorter this and Monk that and all the hardest songs in the world. So, but that's kind of what I do all day here. So I just had to be on top of it. And I think it's really benefited me just as a like player. But yeah, you gotta, you have to know how to explain things, and you have to, well, then again, it's like, I try to, hopefully my way of teaching, my explanations work for everyone. I don't know if they do, right? Because it's impossible to be like the ideal teacher for every single student that comes through. But I definitely try to break things down. And another thing that I realized here is when I first got this job, I was like, am I going to be the guy that just busts everybody on? Okay, what about that chord? You sounded good, except what about that chord right there? Like, what chord? You know the chord I'm talking about. That chord.
Yeah.
And like, be that guy and they're like, oh man, that chord, really? We're going to talk about that chord? I'm like, yeah, we're going to talk about that chord because everything was good except that chord. No, and just be that sort of taskmaster. I don't do it in a rude way, but I kind of feel like it's my job. We just got through juries, so that's a lot of what I do. It's like, okay, it sounds good, but what about that one spot? And they're like, oh, yeah, and they try to like pretend they don't know what spot I'm talking about. Maybe they don't know what spot I'm talking about, which is another issue. But like, just being that guy and like accepting it and trying to do it in a graceful way, rather than just be like, oh man, it's cool, you sound great, There was definitely like, in my experience as a jazz student, there were those teachers that, and I don't think that's always a horrible thing, but that sort of like, oh man, it's cool. Either like, oh man, it's cool, or you're terrible and you should just quit.
Yeah, right.
It's like, no, neither of those things are true. There's that chord, there's that spot, there's that thing that I'm also working on, and that's why I'm aware of it. But we need to like find a way to get you to get better at that thing, and like be real specific and be really methodical about it and surgical, and be like, B flat minor 7 flat 5, what are you doing?
Right.
Stuff like that. And I've resigned myself to being that guy.
Yeah, I think that's great. From the student perspective, I'll say when I was in school, but that was like 6 months ago. But being in that situation, hearing like, sounds good, man, is like, that's nice. But it is, it's helpful to get, really specific feedback like that. And I definitely found that those are the situations where I was able to grow the most. So, I think you've got the right idea there. That's awesome.
And I try to do it in writing. One thing for me that's real important is, you get in that situation where you're in class with all your peers and all your friends. And I'm really sensitive to not being like, stop the band. All right. What I do is like later I'll send, we do evaluations and things. I point it out in writing, like maybe not always like that in a private lesson. It's one thing, but if there's a lot of, people who are in a class with their peers, that's where I think it can get a little bit weird if you're stopping people and like, say there's one person in there who's really got a problem and you're going to stop them every tune. And, so I definitely try to do it email form.
That's probably good too, because I know there's been times where I've totally forgotten things I've heard in a lesson or just in conversation. So, Vin, yet another question?
Well, yeah, and it kind of ties into this a little bit. I was talking with Ryan on a previous podcast, and I asked him, like, what, if any, area did he feel maybe he wasn't quite as prepared as he kind of like maybe should have been when he went to university. So you, as the instructor, is there an area that you think you're like, I kind of wish they'd be a little bit better at, say, reading, or they had worked on their ear training a little more before they came here to the university?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things. I mean, one is, I did I think it was the end of last year, Jazz Guitar Today was like, do the 5 thing. They like the list. Like, what are the 5 things? I was like, I don't know if I got 5. Like, it's got to be 5 is good. But one thing is like this, like it's kind of actually, that's why I wrote these 2 books. One is like, you got to know the fretboard and have command of like where things are so you can get into the right, I say, so you can at least like noodle around in the right key. And that's not what you want to do. I hope not anyway, like artistically or as an improviser, just noodle around in the right key area. But if you don't know where the notes are and you can't noodle around in the right key area, that's a problem. And then if you can do that, then you want to start adding, I think if you aspire to be a jazz guitarist, some stuff that sounds like stuff on a jazz record. And I always say, like, what is jazz vocabulary? It's like the stuff that you hear on jazz records. It's sort of like a circular definition, but certain like melodic fragments, I mean, why are they jazz sounding things? Just because Lee Morgan played them on this record and they became a jazz sounding thing. And so I tell students that are trying to audition at UNT that, so say, well, if someone doesn't know, like they all play blue bossa, right? If when it changes keys, like they can noodle around in C minor and they're cool. C minor, they play C minor pentatonic. But when you have a 2-5-1 in D flat and all those C minor notes are suddenly wrong and they don't go to D flat, I'm like, that's kind of so that's the one thing. And then, so say I have 4 students who noodle around in the right key areas on blue bossa equally well. And one of them comes with an idea from, I don't know, some jazz record. I wouldn't even know where it was from because it's in a certain period of jazz, everybody's playing the same stuff anyway, right? It's like the same language. One of them plays that. I tell the students, like, I'm probably going to, if I have to choose between, I'm going to choose the one that has a little bit of, you can tell they've actually listened to a jazz recording and have started to incorporate that. So I think those 2 things are both important. You rarely do you get like the jazz vocabulary without the scales, although occasionally I've seen that, which is kind of interesting. Like, well, they'll play some jazz vocabulary, but in like the wrong key. And then I'm just like, whoa, that kind of blows my mind. But I've only had a few of those. Usually it's like either they don't have, they have the minor pentatonic and they're faking it, or like they learn the scales, but the vocabulary is not there. And I think that's what, and if we're talking about like a freshman coming in, it doesn't, they don't have to be like killing it completely at 18, or they wouldn't need to go to school anyway. But I feel like those are the 2 areas, and then just like a good attitude, like be nice. Don't be like, it's so hard being a musician and being a performer, being a guitarist. It's good to like come in with an attitude of just knowing how much work it's going to take, and which is hard when you're 18, but you got personality is important as well.
So we always like to ask this question sort of about practicing, and you're interacting with a lot of people who are learning jazz guitar. Is there anything you see that you think is kind of a waste of time that people spend a lot of time doing in their practice session that maybe you would direct them, to maybe focus on something else?
Well, that's an interesting way to think about it. I mean, for me, my practice now, and even I realized like when I was younger, it was always I would set up things that I needed to practice for, or someone else would set them up for me, when I was in school and there was a lesson or there was a test. And now that I'm not in school, like I'll set up basically like, okay, I'm going to do this record. So therefore I have to practice so I don't sound bad on this record, or I need to write some music because I have this record I'm going to do, that the deadline actually comes first for me. And that's how I motivate myself. So yeah, with the students here, I mean, it's funny. I've had some that you can tell they're like just practice monsters, and they're just practicing all the time. And I don't think that there's anything bad about that if you have the instrument in your hand. Although I remember when I was an undergrad, there was a guy who was a friend of mine, and he would play the guitar like 8 hours a day. Oh, he had it in his hand, he was playing. And I noticed, like, I mean, he was good, but it wasn't like he was getting better, like in leaps and bounds based on all this time that he spent practicing. And I realized, like, he's actually just playing through the same stuff over and over again that he already knows. And that's not bad, because that stuff sounds really good, but he's not taking that time. It's not like 8 hours and he's spending a half hour on this and a half hour on that. It's not really goal directed. So I think that, it's good to have just realistic goals about what you're trying to do with your practice. Like, what is it for? And, growing up in New Orleans too, a lot of it was, by the time I could play a little bit, I was doing gigs. And so the practice was, and the gig were kind of the same thing. And you were sort of practicing on the gig, and that, half the time people didn't know the song. So you were doing ear training because you were like, how does that song go? And someone's like, sing it. Or they hold their finger like 1, 2, they do this little thing. Like, what's going on? But then later it was, stuff like, okay, my jury's coming. I need to be able to play this Joe Pass solo, and I can't play it. And just being realistic with myself, like, okay, am I going to be able to play this? Okay, what am I sort of knew what was required just by what it sounded like. And I feel some students, maybe they don't quite, I mean, that's sort of my job, is to be like, hey, it doesn't actually, maybe in your mind, it sounds a certain way. And that's why I use a lot of video too, not to like stump them, but as evidence in case that, and I send it to them. I'm like, hey, here's what it sounded like. Maybe I'm rambling a little bit in my question, in my answer to your question, but yeah, for me, like, the greatest motivator was always like public humiliation. Like, if you don't practice and you embarrass yourself in front of like a lot of people,
again, usually.
That was for me. Yeah, that for me, there were a few times in my life where that's what got me to get serious. And so I think, you just have to be students. You got to be realistic about what you want to sound like, and realize too, I think it's hard to realize how long it takes, the gradual process, and not get frustrated that you didn't go from. Sometimes I'll have students that are attempting things that are just too hard. I'm like, man, don't. And then they're like, oh, I couldn't do it. I wanted to do it, and I worked so hard. And I was like, man, just do like a Grant Green solo. Come on. There are these solos out here that are so, and then you'll accomplish it and you'll be like, yes, and it'll feel good, rather than that Alan Holdsworth solo that maybe one day, if you're lucky, you could play some of it, And I have to be the guy that said, sometimes they're like, oh man, come on, Mr. Mooney. And now I'm Dr. Mooney. Back in the day, I was like, come on, Mr. Mooney. And, but just be goal oriented and be realistic, and realize it's a long, it's a long road, man. And we're all on it. It's a sort of cliched stuff, but it's really true.
Yeah. Well, I think that's some great wisdom for our listeners. So we'll wrap up here. Thanks so much for joining us. It's been really awesome talking to you and getting your insights on things. And I think that'll do it for this episode of the Fret Dojo podcast. I've been Ryan, again joined by Vin, and thanks to Davy Mooney for joining us today.
Thanks, guys. Ryan and Vin, everybody out there.
And for more jazz guitar lessons, tips, and free stuff, visit www.FretDojo.com.